My paper is titled Radiant Ecologies, the Biopolitics of Animal Photography in Exclusion Zones. Before I begin, I would like to state that all the photographs used in this presentation have been reproduced with permission from the respective photographers or taken from public domain sites with appropriate citational credit. In Darman Richter's photo, an apparently tame fox occupies center stage. Its relaxed yet alert posture and outward anticipatory gaze, alluding to its feral field of vision, literally and figuratively beyond the frame. Behind the seated animal and shot at an angle to illustrate its monumental size is a now decaying concrete sign in Russian that reads Pripyat 1970. The date alluding to the year of the Ukrainian city's founding. While all around the canid presence teems lush vegetation, its fecund green hue seemingly radiating out of the ground and suffusing the scene with the spectral light that is characteristic of several of Richter's Chernobyl photos, offering a rich palette of contrasts with the warm tones of fox fur, while offsetting the muted lithic grey of the vestigial semiotics of a long evacuated human presence. The sign points west towards the atomic city, directing our gaze to its short but tragic urban history of decline from planned and manicured Soviet techno-scientific utopia of clean and economical nuclear energy to a dystopian site of catastrophe and loss, while in the foreground, the sign's navigational gesture is undercut and deflected at a right angle by the animal's gaze, mobilizing the field towards an unseen frontal horizon. In the open space to the right, the camera inserts its own optical logos, both engaging in dialogue with and framing the competing visual indices of nature and culture without subsuming these into a totalizing perspective. The camera's triangulating locution invitingly appropriates and draws the viewer's gaze inwards towards an elusive meeting point at the image's center, where culture and nature, human and animal, past and future are suspended in a state of what Isabel Stengers calls reciprocal capture. In 2011, a few weeks after the meltdown of the reactor core at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant led to the release of fatally high doses of radioactive substances into the atmosphere, Shinpei Takeda performed a camera-less photographic experiment. Earlier, he had toured the devastated sites of Okuma in the vicinity of the TEPCO power plant and collected soil samples. Placed on photosensitive paper and left in darkness, these samples created their personal photographic prints. The high doses of ionizing radiation absorbed by exposed particles acting at once as a source of internal illumination and an inscriptional mechanism. Called radioautographs, these automatic images, formed without the mediation of a recording or capturing device, testify to the paradox at the heart of the relationship between photography and radiation. Akira Mizuta Lippitt, in his book Atomic Light, discusses how the introduction and popularization of nuclear energy as the apotheosis of military-industrial modernity in the 20th century brought about a radicalization of the field of visuality and visual practices, including artistic practices, through the capacity of radioactive phenomena to overturn dominant metaphysical conceptions of visible and invisible, outside and inside, transparent and opaque, presence and absence. From Wilhelm Röntgen and Antoine Henry Becquerel's deployment of radiation as a form of image-making process that could permeate, render porous, and ultimately overturn the epidermally bounded and enclosed body, to the cultural phobias, anticipations, and anxieties around the twin tropes of technological progress and planetary annihilation engendered by atomic power, and explored in particular through an affectively charged and ideologically inflected nuclear imaginary in the post-war period, Nuclearity emerges in the 20th century as a complex conceptual epistemological material and geopolitical field constellated around questions of militarization, nationalism, and economic development, structured by the norms of capitalist production on the one hand and the requirements of emergent biopolitical surveillance and security regimes on the other. For Daniel Berkner, the tantalizing spectrality of radioactivity that is at once invisible to the human eye, yet profoundly and lethally reactive and invasive, produces its own form of bifurcated visual schema. An iconographic model that involves tangential representations of symbolic landscapes where radioactive impact is recorded indirectly through figurations of absence, loss, decay, mutation, and debility, and a material model where photochemical media are used to directly capture actual particles of radiation. In both cases, however, the quantum dynamics of radioactive matter as both a tangible material substance and a set of protracted, dispersed, intangible, and indirect effects that mediate and transform our corporeal experience of time and space intersects with visual epistemologies and representational practices to generate new ways of looking. To update Walter Benjamin's concept of the optical unconscious, that otherwise invisible domain inaccessible to the human eye, opened up by modern visual and cinematic media's technologies of close-up enlargement and slow motion, irradiated environments as subjects of photographic capture enable the formation of a nuclear unconscious that generate idioms and imaginaries of what Lippitt calls avisuality, forms of visualizing the invisible which destabilize hierarchical binaries between the seen and unseen that structures much of Western thought. As scholarship by Weir, Lawson, and O'Brien suggest, nuclear photography, be it the state-sponsored visual repertoire idealizing atomic energy's peaceful and prophylactic uses circulated during the Cold War period, or the rise of hybrid multimedia practices, from documentary photojournalism to art and experimental photography, emerges as a generative site for articulating visual culture's links in the late capitalist period with techno-scientific geopolitical regimes, particularly in the ways in which the specific concerns that are intrinsic to visualizing atomic power and nuclear cultures are concerns that inform and are pertinent to the Anthropocene as a nuclear formation. These include the dialectics of the visible and invisible, the question of absences, elisions, suppressions, and their illicit or violent returns to the cultural or psychic scene, the modern recalibration and politicization of life as an increasingly permeable site subject to constantly shifting standards of legibility, legitimacy, and control, and the omnipresence of forms of death that acquire necropolitical dimensions in modernity, shifting from private and individual domains to becoming associated with capitalism's colonial, extractive, and carceral practices and extended thus to forms of species-wide and planetary extinctions. In the era of nuclear energy politics, the geologic record created by human activity becomes inseparable from the wastelands of radioactive decay set into motion by atomic particles. It is in these two senses. Firstly, the avisual representational possibilities opened up by radio-ecological imaging, and secondly, nuclear energy's encoding of the vital significance of the invisible, imperceptible, and intangible as dominant phenomenologies in the Anthropocene, either in the form of such planetary hyperobjects as climate change and global warming, or through neoliberalism's technologies of exclusion, elision, and erasure of populations and ecosystems, that nuclear photography, both as a critical methodological anchor and a practice of environmental intervention, what Carla McManus calls eco-photography, becomes pertinent to the question of the non-human. It is in this vein that photography in the context of nuclear disasters addresses the crisis of representation that Rob Nixon, in his important work on emergent forms of contemporary global violence, identifies as central to the disparities and damages of our times. The photography of animals in sites irradiated by nuclear disasters thus serve as critical explorations of the specific form of precarization that accompanies neoliberal capitalism's military-industrial mobilization of planetary resources. Beyond their ethical and political import as archives of and commentary on the question of non-human victimhood, exploitation, commodification, and invisibilization, these photographs also underscore the hidden subtext of the ecological implications of rampant nuclearization and the anthropocentric hubris that underlies these new regimes of energy and resource mobilization. The snapshot of flora and fauna in landscapes devastated or rendered inhospitable to humans in the wake of radioactive fallout are not mere documents of singular events. Rather, these images point to the permanent state of risk that is the constitutive condition of life that humans and non-humans are forced to inhabit, the omnipresent horizon of disaster and accident that is a structural feature of the Anthropocene. By foregrounding animals and the fate of non-human subjects in anthropogenic disasters, these images shift the focus of suffering to forms of life, death, survival, impairment, sentience, and sociality under conditions of duress that do not posit the human as their protagonist, while simultaneously dissociating this anthropological centrality from the domain of visual representation itself. This paper wishes to examine photographic representations of animal life in the post-disaster landscapes of Chernobyl and Fukushima. By examining the work of photographers working with multiple media and at the intersection of art photography, photojournalism, animal, environmental, and anti-nuclear activism, species rescue, fostering, and caregiving in these radioactive sites, my analysis aims to understand how specific modes of visual engagement with and interpretation of non-human life in places affected by anthropogenic and climatic disasters interacts with scientific and popular cultural imaginaries of non-human flourishings and endangerments in disaster ecologies, particularly tropes that posit animal life in depopulated sites of nuclear disaster as both miraculously immune to the biological damage caused to humans by radiation exposure, as well as thriving in the wake of human evacuation, particularly in the absence of farming, industrial, and commercial activity. This approach to resurgent flora and fauna in emergent radioecological sites has been deployed in recent times by scientific analyses as well as popular discourses to depict animals, particularly wildlife, as prolific and invasive, governed by an inhuman excess that allows them to thrive in environments otherwise hostile to humans. This narrative of an alien affinity towards forms of toxicity, while positioning animals on a common spectrum of danger and alterity in which they share attributes of anarchic and uncontained growth, dispersal, and mutation with nuclear waste and the action of radioactivity, simultaneously obscures other narratives of precarity and harm accruing to non-human lives and habitats through their proximity to nuclear pollution and pollution's ties with anthropogenic military-industrial regimes. The nexus of toxic exposures and ecocidal effects. The nexus of toxic exposures and ecocidal effects of nuclearization of environments not only impinges on existing ecological relations, altering and corroding these, but also enforces new and saturated chemical, or what Ibn Kirksky calls chemosocial ecologies. Through a close reading of the works of Julia Oldham, Yasusuke Ota, and Pier Paolo Mitica, and placing their photographic work in dialogue with a recent turn in biopolitical inquiry that seeks to reconfigure Foucault's analysis of biopower in relation to the current reinscriptions of life, livability, and politics within the structures and infrastructures set in place by neoliberal geopolitical regimes of extractive and planet-burning consumption and control in the Anthropocene, my paper wishes to engage with the implicit dialogue between such radioactive ecologies in post-disaster sites, in the wake of evacuation and abandonment, and the ways in which visual media, particularly photography, participate in these ecological arrangements by encoding animal life and its survival in the post-human aftermath of human departure within several symbolic and semantic codes. Julia Oldham's visual projects, photographs of dogs living in the exclusion zone and an accompanying documentary, Fallout Dogs, frame the companion species as a figure of the quintessential survivor of a nuclear apocalypse. The stray animal is the series' unexpected hero. Survivors of ecocide and inheritors of a destroyed habitat, the dogs of Pripyat are atypical candidates for heroic or messianic roles. Oldham's work, undertaken in collaboration with guides and local residents of the exclusion zone, dwells in the rich interpretive possibilities of this dissonance, toying with the visual world building inspired by Chernobyl's resurgent animal populations. In these photographs, liminal figures of homeless dogs occupying a fuzzy hybrid threshold between wild and tame, feral and domestic, outside and inside, stray and pet, ask us to rethink what concepts of heroism, salvation, survival and resurrected life might look like, removed from their moorings in the grand eschatological narratives and reconfigured in relation to the minor, quotidian, unglamorous and monotonous registers of the animal's daily, even habitual negotiations with its Umwelt. Oldham's Chernobyl triptych, using resources of multiple mediums and genres, still photography, documentary cinema, stylized digital photo collages that make up the Dogs of Future Earth, series, depart from conventions of doomsday scenarios and carefully steer clear of the imposition of an overtly didactic point of view, even as they subversively and playfully mobilize generic tropes, most commonly those of science fiction and fantasy. Thus, in an opposite move from the visual templates of wild profusion popularized by photographers like David Macmillan and Robert Polidori, Oldham's focus is not so much on the purported reclamation and dissolution of human structures by floral and faunal flourishings. Instead, her photography unpacks questions of symbiotic coexistence, co-constitution and caregiving as valid ethical responses, practices and modes of collectively witnessing damaged ecosystems by following and documenting modes of adaptation, occupation and use by which animals establish new relations with old topographies without necessarily displacing or usurping these. The idea of non-human salvage of human spaces is central to Oldham's tongue-in-cheek collages where dogs are shown as awkwardly and creatively repurposing the material universe left behind by extinct humans. Electronic monitors, satellite dishes, furniture and toys. While performing a gesture of decentering the human, these images also elusively dramatize and memorialize the tragic suffering of the pets that were left behind during Chernobyl's evacuation, using a futuristic setup to illustrate those disaster histories involving animal suffering that risk being erased from public memory. One image in particular, that of different canine breeds wearing gas masks looking out from what appears to be a ruined assembly area, offer multiple interpretive possibilities. In terms of its fictional content, the image's strategic anthropomorphism creates an alternative speculative planetary order that is dominated by hitherto marginalized species. However, placed in the context of the nuclear disaster, the canine assembly also testifies to those ancestors of Oldham's subjects in her Chernobyl documentary who were consigned to interminable waiting and dying in abandonment, and for whom the evacuation that was itself premised on a speciesistic arbitration claiming human lives as more valuable than animal ones presented an extinction scenario. The title of the photo collage, coupled with the military accoutrements, also hints at the animal's existence in relation to a pervasive cultural norm of speciesistic violence, what Dinesh Wadewell in his provocative book calls, quote, the war against animals, unquote, of which nuclear toxicity and abuse and abandonment in the wake of disasters, as well as technoscientific exploitation of docile animal bodies for furthering human knowledge, are interconnected strands. Oldham's futuristic settings, while celebrating canine ingenuity and resourcefulness, continually index the close links that these so-called future Earth settings, landfills, toxic ruins, and e-waste dumps share with current landscapes of environmental degradation. In these techno-dystopias, radiation's invisible and spectral presence haunts these photos in their extended commentary on the politics of planetary toxification and critique of modernity's instrumental reason, of which the nuclear fallout serves as at once allegory and catalyst. Oldham's photos in Fallout Dogs, taken during her stay in the exclusion zone, are intimate portraits of a form of multi-species coexistence that has emerged in abandoned topographies, and what Jonathan Turnbull, in relation to his own visual ethnography of human-canine relationships in the zone, calls, quote, new forms of living, dying, and caring in relation to toxic exposures, unquote. In these images, we see dogs, all of them named and identified, juxtaposed with depopulated urban structures. Their lively and playful postures contrasted with the somber starkness of monumental constructions. The animal's ludic absorption in and attunement to its immediate environment is placed in an ironic contrast with the now empty symbolism of Pripyat's decrepit Soviet-era iconography. Low-angle, decentered shots of dogs lounging in front of memorial statuary, exploring the ramparts of derelict buildings, or using abandoned structures as sites of frolic, rest, and exploration offer modes of recontextualizing the disaster by offering a dog's eye view of ruins. The images that are in turn products of the photographer's intimate, laborious encounter present ruins not as a heavily overdetermined and static indexical site of eliciting nostalgia for a reified anthropocentric history, but instead as vital, lively, and contingent material components of the animal's immediate environment and meaning system. However, Oldham's photos are not oblivious to the permeation of this material environment by radioactive toxicity. In a series of close-ups of feeding dogs, the presence of the animal bone at the focal center of the photograph not only alludes to questions of survival, violence, particularly threats from wolves and foxes, with whom the dogs share a common habitat, and kinds of exposures to harm and danger that are embedded in the very ecosystem, entering the dog's body in the form of radionuclides, in the highly saturated soil, or genetic mutations undergone by birds and insects that enter the food chain. The feral memento mori also foregrounds the spectral omnipresence of death and disease as integral to irradiated sites like Chernobyl. In his photo-voicing project on canine-human companionship in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, Turnbull observes that while the specific scientifically measurable and theorizable effects of radiation on animal biology continues to remain a matter of controversial debate and speculation, new kinds of affective bonds and social norms of companionship and reciprocity, distributed ownership and collective care, or detached forms of engagement that are more loosely structured than those with household pets, for instance, have emerged in the radioecological landscape based in a, quote, potential for shared exposure which reveals a shared animality, unquote. This intersectional space, where common threats from radiation, loneliness, disease, and wild animals, and shared grounds of resources and labor, guarding checkposts, patrolling desolate spaces, surviving attenuated climatic conditions, foster relationships between working-class security personnel and dogs, is neither an apocalyptic wasteland nor a primordial Eden. Rather, it is a site that generates new forms of attention, attunement, and interdependence, where the centrality of the anthropocentric norm is replaced by post-humanist reconfigurations of concepts of personhood, autonomy, sovereignty, and agency in relation to terminal sites of risk and finitude. The intimate playfulness of Oldham's photos is, however, missing from Yasusuke Ota's semi-documentary portraits of animal subjects caught in abandoned city spaces in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima reactor meltdown. A combination of humor and pathos informs Ota's meticulous documentation of the fate of escaped pets and farm animals, abandoned livestock, and shelter animals in the days following the triple disasters. We see a solitary ostrich loitering in an abandoned neighborhood, distressed and fatigued pigs trying to cool themselves in a pothole, traumatized pets wandering through rubble, cattle patiently waiting for the return of humans. As the title of the series, Abandoned Animals of Fukushima, indicates, abandonment is a central informing theme of Ota's photography, where a conscious parallel is constantly suggested between the bodies of the urban animals and the derelict and empty post-evacuation habitats that they find themselves in. However, as an active volunteer who participated in rescue, rehabilitation and care of abandoned pets and farm animals, Ota is careful not to suggest a too neat and unproblematic symbolic collapse between material ruin and abandoned critters. The question of care is at the heart of Ota's post-disaster animal photography. Entering the Fukushima no-go zone illegally as a volunteer, Ota, along with a group of civilian animal activists, were among the first responders to cater to the non-human victims of the tsunami nuclear disaster. In the event of the disaster, the government's immediate response with regard to animals was that of culling. Considered to be toxic, animals including livestock and strays were shot as part of the government's cleanup and disaster management efforts. In an essay accompanying his photos, Ota attributes his documentary impulse to the government's inadequate and callous treatment of suffering animals, including forced secrecy, misinformation, and restricted access to places with trapped and injured animals. A trenchant and ironic illustration of this critique is the image of an ostrich, later found to be the mascot of TEPCO, the company owning the nuclear plant, walking down an empty street. While captured as a documentary vignette of the new ordinary in the aftermath of the disaster, the affective potential of the image lies in its staging of discordances and jarring discrepancies that telescopes the living experience of the catastrophe by performatively elaborating the cognitive challenge and perceptual disorientation that is shared by human and animal survivors of large-scale calamities. The outlandish spatial tableau created by the presence of an exotic wild animal in the symmetrical layout of a modern urban neighborhood, walking alongside road signs and neatly arranged residential blocks, while serving as an absurdist allegory of the excesses of the Capitalocene, also comments on the animal's vulnerability under capitalism's sacrificial conditions. Eschewing the dangers, however, of emptying the animal of critical potential by sublimating it to the status of iconicity, what Lippitt calls the animal's animetaphoricity, in contemporary representational parlance, Ota's photo suggestively refuses the frontal and confrontational position, choosing to shoot the animal from the rear as it recedes and is subsumed into an uncertain but claustrophobic horizon. Here, Ota subverts representational conventions and their categorical and taxonomic epistemes by refusing the human spectator access to the animal's gaze, which is diverted towards its own exploratory activity as it examines an object in its own field of vision and attention. As John Berger laments that modern forms of visuality augmented by technological media like photography and cinema have, in conjunction with extinction cascades and institutions of animal carceration like zoos and laboratories, by appropriating the animal's gaze and decimating its natural habitats, have rendered it empty, Ota's photos of animals in post-disaster spaces challenge visual media's appropriative gesture by highlighting forms of non-human adjustment and negotiations with altered or destroyed ecologies, and transforming the photographic surface into a shared affective space of mutual participation in what Jean-Luc Nancy calls the equivalence of catastrophes. There's images of pigs trying to cool off in a small puddle on the street, wolves occupying an empty parking lot outside a mall, abandoned pets in the midst of rubble and wreckage are not just melancholic evocations of pathos, where spectatorial empathy occurs from a detached vantage of species difference. Rather, the displacement and estrangement captured by these photographs perform the function of a Barthesian punctum. The accidental element in an image that stands out of its immediate denotative or referential context to assault and interlocute the viewer through the forceful transmission of a disorienting affect that brings to a crisis the viewer's cognitive limits, perceptual habits, and epistemological assumptions. The anthropogenic accident of nuclear meltdown is transcribed in the photograph as a visually encoded figuration of the accidental, as a form of dislocation and discrepancy that illuminates with urgent affective pressure the impossibility of a sanitized spectatorial vantage in an increasingly toxified and enmeshed world. In the wake of the Fukushima disaster, several animal advocacy groups like JEERS, ARC, Kansai and Japan Cat Network volunteered to participate in rescue and care operations, often crossing into the radioactive zone, illicitly carrying food, water and medical supplies for animals in distress. One such volunteer is Matsumura Naoto, who has now returned to the evacuated area and has turned his home into a sanctuary for abandoned pets and livestock animals. In Nota's photographic series documenting the intimate relationship of caregiving and multi-species entangled inhabitation that has developed in Naoto's sanctuary that now houses not only rescued pets but also offers shelter and veterinary care to rehabilitated ostriches and cows, this question of enmeshment is visually dramatized. As in the case of Oldham's Fallout dogs, human-animal relationships in these novel radio ecologies are not constructed on old lines of proprietorial and possessive humanism. The dogs of Chernobyl or the cats and cattle of Fukushima are not pets or farm animals. The multi-species relationships that emerge in shared contexts of risk and exposure are characterized by unstable, contingent, mutating forms of encounter and cohabitation. The species divide that sustains the metaphysics of human exceptionalism at the core of the capitalist will to mastery is no longer tenable under nuclear conditions, where the scope of disaster cannot be entirely local or bounded by national borders, but is symptomatic of the Anthropocene's planetary inscription, calling in turn for new post-nuclear disaster imaginaries based in a recognition of the scalar dispersion and magnitude of exposures to risk. In Chernobyl Record, physicist R.F. Mould describes the natural ecology of the exclusion zone as follows. The zone around the NPP, having minimal disturbance by humans compared with former times, has now become in effect a wildlife reserve, with the wildlife populations increasing by 1998 by as much as a factor 10 compared to the levels of 1986. Even a family of lynxes have been observed. The current population in what is a very ancient forest is estimated to be 3,000 foxes, 600 moose, 450 deer and 40 wolves, and perhaps upwards of 3,000 boars, of which in the 1980s had been hunted almost to extinction because they were regarded as such a delicacy. The incidence of the flourishing of previously endangered animal populations in the depopulated radioactive zone has been observed across many studies, leading to Chernobyl's iconic stature as one of the world's largest biodiversity sanctuaries. This trope of rewilding and reclamation of spaces by flora and fauna is further supported by studies on radiation hormesis that suggest that rather than causing cellular damage and chromosomal mutations, long-term exposure to low doses of toxicity, including radioactive nuclides, can build resistance to damage and disease. This theory has been challenged in recent times in studies that demonstrate the incremental and long-term effects of radiation exposure on animals. The most influential among these is the work of Timothy Musu and Anders Moeller, who have spent the past 2 decades studying ornithological records of radiation levels in the exclusion zone. According to their groundbreaking findings, categories of health and normalcy, when applied to animals living in radioactive territories, need to be considered along expanded temporal scales, since mutations and deformities have an intergenerational gestation period, endangering the animal at a species rather than individual level. Their studies have identified barn swallows suffering from albinism and depigmentation as a result of the damage of melanocytes under the effect of radiation. The same swallows are found with deformed feet and toes, abnormally shaped feathers, and multiple tumors, sometimes measuring up to 0.5 inches in diameter, and cataracts or impaired vision that affect their flight behavior, leading to premature deaths. Similarly, in another study by Robert Baker of Texas Tech University, bank voles are seen to have altered genomes as a direct result of living in close proximity to the region's highly radioactive soils and consuming toxic lichens that store concentrated amounts of radiation. In their research on the ways in which radiation not only affects individual species but is magnified and protracted into what Mary Maceo calls a state of being, so that the event of the nuclear disaster is no longer understood as a state of shock but seen as a radioactive state never encountered in nature on such a scale before. Maceo and Rebecca Johnson study the ways in which radiation enters ecosystems through interlocking grids of interdependent relationships that structure them, making its way up the food chain and altering the very ontological constitution of particular ecologies. Thus, while it may seem to the uninformed eye that the zone's evacuation put an end to industrialization, deforestation, cultivation, and other human intrusions, making it one of Ukraine's environmentally cleanest regions, Chernobyl's soil, with accumulated nuclear fallout washed into it by years of radioactive rain, continues to be highly toxic, with cesium-137 traveling through roots into plants and passing into the bones of animals, where it is deposited, so much so that the bones of some large animal carcasses in the zone are so radioactive that some scientists prefer to wear gloves to handle them. This radioactive contamination of the earth corroborates in turn Musso and Muller's observation that the near extinction of certain insect populations in the zone, like Musso and Muller's observation about the near extinction of certain insect populations in the zone, like spiders and red firebugs that lay their doomed eggs in the soil. These investigations of Chernobyl's radioecological forensics attest to the manner in which invisible and slow-occurring subtexts of precarity underlie the more utopian narratives of rewilding that often end up obscuring or minimizing the extent of ecological damage. Subtexts which are slow to emerge and even slower to gain traction and attention because of the cultural marginality of the non-charismatic animal subjects, rodents, birds, insects, that bear the brunt of harm. Mayumi Ito, in her detailed investigation of the condition of animals during and after the Fukushima disaster, charts the nexus of lack of disaster preparedness, ambiguously conveyed evacuation protocols, and negligence on the part of authorities that led to a parallel silent catastrophe involving the 3,500 head of cattle, 30,000 pigs, 6,300,000 chickens, in addition to companion animals and heirloom horses trained for Shinto cavalry races, captive wildlife in Fukushima Zoo and Tohoku Safari Park that comprised a thriving livestock and urban and suburban animal population that had to be left behind, often tied to their posts. According to Ito, it is estimated that more than 22,000 companion species and 6,600,000 livestock died. The Japanese national media and government authorities, however, initially chose to suppress this information, underplaying the enormity of animal suffering in the disaster's wake. It is this silence that Ota seeks to address through his photography, responding, as he says in an essay, to a need to inform the world and leave evidence of what really happened. In the apocalyptic scenographies of Pier Paolo Mittica, photography acquires narrative dimensions as scenes of depletion, death, mourning, and exhaustion, human and non-human, are mediated through, set against, and analogized in relation to an extended topology of disaster. Dramatic, dark clouds, rocky and rugged terrain brought into sharp, almost three-dimensional relief, architectural rubble, grain and dirt on the bodies and hazmat suits of cleanup workers, skeletal remains of dead animals, and shadows and lines furrowing the contours of human skin collectively constitute an embodied topography where the vestiges of radioactive contamination are inscribed photographically in the image's articulation of bodily duress and debilitation produced by living and laboring in toxic aftermaths of anthropogenic disasters. If the central paradox of photographing nuclear disaster is radiation's invisibility, in Mittica's photographs, atomic invisibility is transcribed through a process of visibilizing other forms of invisibilization of lives, labor, communities, and affects under capitalism's construction of particular sensory regimes, or what Jacques Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. A particularly poignant image from Mittica's nuclear trilogy project is that of farm animals at their stations, juxtaposed with long decomposed skeletal remains of their fellow creatures. A cow gazes piercingly into the camera. Yet unlike Berger's characterization of the vacant look of the captured animal that has been denuded of all agency, here the image's pictorial language reanimates the creaturely look, but not as an anthropomorphic projection of sentimentalized emotion or an allegorical representation of suffering that ethicists like Peter Singer privilege as a mark of the animal's legal status and moral value. In the photo, the camera is placed low, almost at ground level, eschewing the human subject's bipedal and upright vantage and distending the frame to contextualize the lone animal in a wider matrix of entropy and loss. An off-center and tilted perspective coupled with an eerie light seems to both bifurcate the scene and provide the flat pictorial surface with the depth that signals the image's location and time, informed by historical forces, rather than being a mere snapshot of the animal as an object of visual consumption and commodification. This particular arrangement, instead of petrifying the creaturely gaze, liberates it as an affective vector, a disorienting and discomforting charge that erupts while destabilizing existing modes of spectatorship. The animal's gaze brings our eye level to the ground, where in a corner next to the live creature lie the bones of a dead one, its body still chained to the spot, suggesting a painful and protracted death by starvation while waiting to be rescued, that as scholarship on Fukushima's animals indicate was the shared fate of many. Here the image generates its own interpretive conditions, creating a visual idiom of mourning where grief is not a solely human emotion and acts of feeling the animal's suffering are not based in a translation of animal affects from the perspective of human moral and ethical norms regarding the definition of what constitutes suffering. Instead, the photograph's proximity to death, decay, and survival as a set of material effects, with which the image as a material object and photography as a cultural practice with ecological ties and implications share a common ground, enables us to encounter non-human articulations of loss and grieving outside the semantic limitations imposed by anthropocentric rubrics. Loss is dispersed, much like radiation's scope, through the environment that the animal finds itself in, part of the fabric of a ruptured ecology. Metika's image urges the viewer to consider death not just as an event that impinges on particular beings, and grief thus not simply as an emotion that is tied to particular constituencies, but as modes of inhabiting the absence and violations that accompany the loss of specific ecological possibilities, ways of living, relating to, cohabiting, making sense, that occur when entire ecosystems are endangered by anthropogenic calamities. In both this image and a corresponding one that depicts an ostrich peering into the lens, its inquisitive gaze framed by its dead companion in the background, disaster's implications for animals is measured not just as what affects human-animal relations, but relations among animals as well. The heavily textured and delineated radioactive landscapes in Metika's photos recalibrate the photograph as an extra visual, haptic, and corporeal space, underscoring what Margaret Olin and Tina Campt refer to as the photograph's capacity to transcend a purely optical register and activate other sensory capacities in the viewer. By using the image to articulate a carnal politics that puts the finite, suffering, and malleable flesh to the center of visual representation, Metika's photos engage in what Beatrice da Costa and Kavita Philip call tactical biopolitics, modes of activist and artistic engagements with biopolitical enclosures and arrangements, particularly those that involve the control of bodies reduced to a depoliticized and sacrificial animality. In these images of abandoned farms, life and death, fecundity and loss enter into what Agamben calls a zone of indistinction, those thresholds marking the limits of modern sociopolitical structures, where life, extracted, articulated, and attributed in certain ways and in association with certain forms, is inserted into a regime of death. In a reworking of biopolitical critique, Nicole Shukin and Carrie Wolf have cautioned us. The tendency in postmodern philosophy to posit a common ground of animality as that part of life that is subtracted and excluded from the model of politically qualified life proper to humanity can run the risk of reducing the real flesh and blood animal to a metaphor for a debased and dehumanized figure as an instrument of the latter's desubjectivation. Within the schema, the animal becomes instrumentalized as part of what remains, despite its critical focus, a patently anthropocentric semiotic structure. This in turn prevents us from gaining access to the ways in which animal bodies are invested, inscribed and exploited by capitalism's necropolitical apparatuses, factory farms, testing labs, landfills and the blasted landscapes that are left in the wake of radioactive, chemical and other toxic industrial forms of ecocide. Medical's documentation of radioactive landscapes foregrounds the ways in which seemingly isolated disaster scenarios in fact work in close conjunction with pre-existing structures of death and extinction, encoded in the very ways in which life as a site of extraction, colonization and control becomes the very ground where differential and exclusionary paradigms of recognition, conservation and salvation are secured. While radioactive fallout's planetary reach is a scale or boundary-defying hyperobject, toxicity's effects in relation to the unequal distribution of injury and harm within contemporary biopolitics are not uniform or universal. What does rewilding look like in sites that are irreversibly irradiated by toxic substances? What behavioral patterns, ecological interdependencies, and modes of survival do animals in these regions adopt, especially where the very experience of disaster is not instantaneous or spectacular, but a form of slow and incremental seepage of toxicity and harm, and where the dispersed and distended temporal scale occasions complex niches of pleasure, joy, playfulness, and companionship between species consigned to a common horizon of damage, thus making clear-cut divisions between doomsday scenarios and lively flourishing difficult to be drawn. The photographs explored in this paper attempt to engage these questions, while also alerting us to the largely anthropocentric epistemic and juridical frameworks within which categories of suffering, precarity, victimhood, and debility are configured. Frameworks in which visual mediums participate as producers and mobilizers of the discursive and semantic horizons of what is seen and the ways in which viewing operates. Thank you.